If you want an idea of what it's like to play for Celtic, then all you have to do is look at the reaction online from Celtic's 3-0 defeat to Rangers at the weekend, despite the fact that Celtic have already secured the league title, already secured the League Cup, and are on their way to a domestic treble with the Scottish Cup final coming up very now soon.
Hopefully, don't be a jinx, Enda.
Well, I'm just adding that it is part of what is actually coming up. But despite that, very, very heavy defeat to Rangers at the weekend and a very angry response to the performance that was put in by the Celtic players. So that is the pressure that comes with playing for Celtic. And that is what Ange Postecoglou said as well after the game. There are no freebies when it comes to being part of an Ange Postecoglou Celtic side. And James, this was not a freebie for the players who come in, and they definitely weren't let off scot-free by the fans afterwards.
No, not at all. But before we get into that, I want to address a slanderous rumor that's in the comments already from Tobago Street Police Station, CSC. I was not out walking the dog. That's why we're 5 minutes late, because my dog was barking, and I had to try and get her to quiet down. So the nuance is important. I was not out walking the dog. It is my fault that we were 5 minutes late, though. Yeah, it was. It's one of those games. It's like we've been talking about this for weeks now. How we kind of look like a tired team, and maybe the edge is off a little bit, and there's this narrative running about we don't stop, and obviously Ange being a beloved, high quality manager and all these things, but these people are freaking human beings, right? We've talked about that too. And the idea that they are impervious to, a relative letdown in intensity. I had somebody, forgive me, off the top of my head, I forget who it was, or else I'd mention who, give them credit, but somebody on Twitter, asked me to look up the number of fouls in the game. Not from a, I don't think his motivation was, I didn't think when he asked me, it was like, oh, like a refereeing thing. It was more so like, where was the intensity at? So Celtic only had 4 fouls in the game, and that's like 1/4 of what we've typically had against Rangers this season, in a range. So, that speaks to the fact that this wasn't a team flying around with their hair on fire in a derby matchup with massive amounts of intensity. And it's that unforgivable and gutless, and you get all these wonderful adjectives that people ascribe to people, and these poor players that do pour their guts into a season, by all accounts, for so many weeks on end. So yeah, it wasn't great. A lot of things didn't go well. The intensity level was probably down a notch or 2 or 3. The turnover in players a little bit, some people getting an opportunity to play, which again is what these games were for. Right? The league's over. If you're going to stress test some of these guys in this kind of environment, pretty good time to do it. I mean, you can't just in perpetuity keep running the same guys out there, that kind of thing. At least in my opinion, that's my view. I think it's reasonable that we played some players that haven't gotten much game time, that kind of thing. So, yeah, some of the reaction was entertaining, I guess is another way to put it.
Yeah. Stephen Arbuckle in the comments, I think this is the best way to describe both our tardiness for the podcast and also the performance at the weekend. He says 2 words, not good enough. So.
Fair enough. And you know what? And it is. I agree. Like, in a perfect world, it wasn't good enough. But it's not a perfect world. And like I said, these people are human. And probably the thing I took most umbrage with was, kind of picking out some of the younger players that haven't played that much. And they weren't good, right? So this is not trying to defend crap performances, but pretty much the whole team was crap. I mean, Callum McGregor was pretty awful. Hitate wasn't great. Starfelt probably was the one that you could say, hey, he actually played, pretty good overall. Hart wasn't great. So there was plenty of, not great to go around. And I think that, and this is independent. Like I'm not suggesting that Bernabe or an O or Kobayashi are necessarily quote unquote good enough or not. Like I'm just saying that off of this game alone, I think it's pretty harsh to extrapolate at, or for this to be the threshold of the straw that breaks the camel's back as far as making that determination. Because again, it was just a pretty putrid collective effort that manifested in a lot of players looking, unimpressive.
Well, here's the thing, because most of the reaction, I would say, or analysis from this was that this was an opportunity for players to step up into their positions and, potentially fight for a place in the Scottish Cup final. It was sort of a showing of where Celtic's depth is really at, and that a lot of players come up short. But I guess the counterpoint I would make to that, so Celtic's starting lineup at the weekend was Joe Hart in goals, Bernabei came in at left back, Kobayashi left centre back with Starfelt on the right, and Anthony Ralston played right back. O'Reilly, Cal McGregor, and Rio Hatate. That's a normal starting midfield for Celtic. And then Lila Bada, who hasn't played much this season, with O and Jota up front. Look, O had a good opportunity, hit the post, unlucky. He probably didn't do much outside of that. Abada didn't do much in the game at all. Kobayashi was probably found out for 2 goals, and Bernabei, most of the attacking was coming down his side for one good reason, because he was pretty poor all round on the ball and off the ball at the weekend. But the counterpoint I would make to the fact that some of these players are coming in, and it might have shown up that the lack of the Celtics depth isn't as strong as it was, or the people might have thought it was. These players are there as squad players or as people to come in if there's somebody injured. They're not going to be there to be playing as part of the starting 11 in that combination. Like, I'll put it this way. So Starfelt is Celtic starting left centre back. Kobayashi came in because that's going to be the partnership for the rest of the season, as Cameron Carter-Vickers is out injured. Those two aren't going to play together much. But the question is Kobayashi good enough to come in to replace either Starfelt or Cameron Carter-Vickers if one of them are out injured? I think the answer outside of this game is probably yes. But he's playing beside Bernabei, who is also coming in for the first time, who's playing with Rio Hatate and Jota in front of him, without Maeda, who's going to be doing a lot of the defensive work that would naturally cover up a lot of Bernabei's weaknesses. So that's probably not going to happen all that much. And then you have Lila Bada playing on the right, who hasn't really played that much. He's playing beside O. Those two probably aren't going to play together all that much in a starting lineup with Jota on the left. So it's not that these players are individually not good enough. It's more that if you put them all together on the pitch at the same time, that's when you start to see the real issue with this.
Well, and so the true gentleman, Steve McGrory, in the comments, and Steve's always such a nice guy. I always enjoy interacting with him on Twitter. So appreciate you watching, Steve, and commenting, is, if it was just those guys and they were collectively awful, but the midfield was pretty putrid. And, again, let's be frank about this. And again, this did not come out of nowhere. I would argue that the relative tactics of the two teams, that, Rangers probably got the better of it, meaning that they, Beal pretty clearly has adjusted his tactics against us. We talked about that since the League Cup final, where he kind of bottomed out as being naively horrible, and he has been improving since. And he went to this kind of box midfield 4 that kind of moves into a diamond at times. So he appears to have made the decision to kind of, crowd the midfield and try to win that battle against our midfield. And, again, I'm not rendering final judgment on any of the midfielders. Like, it was pretty much 4v3 a lot of the game, and our midfield didn't play great in a dead rubber game when these guys have played a lot of minutes in games, and Hatate's not that long off of a fresh injury, that kind of stuff. So it's like, on the margins, I would say we probably lost the tactical battle to a degree. So again, that's context. It's not to excuse Kobayashi's performance, but all the things that you just mentioned, with a midfield that's outnumbered in front of him, that isn't playing that great, and a Rangers team that pretty clearly had a higher level of intensity. Let's be frank about it. They had more to play for. Because a lot of the narratives about our guys getting, a chance also applies to their guys. And, they're guys that are clearly on the off weren't playing. I mean, McGregor didn't play, Kent didn't play, and Morales didn't play. Those are the three big kind of keystone underperformers this season. The disgruntled, not so much McGregor, but the other two who's theoretically disgruntled players. So they had guys that hadn't played as many minutes, like Matondo, who's no great shakes, but he's a fast guy who was applying himself in a system that was, in tactics that were reasonably well thought out. And, that makes the whole matchup, I think, even tougher for the guys that kind of came off the bench cold, that haven't had that many game minutes, that are relatively young. A guy like O, who again isn't with Celtic that long, hasn't gone through a preseason where he's kind of, hitting all of this on the ground on the fly. So, again, I have bigger concerns. And I think, if anything, this kind of result is, and I don't want to call it welcome, because I hate ever having that kind of a result against them. But, there's always this risk of getting too big for your britches. I don't know if that's a saying over in Ireland.
We
And
usually say boots, but
you use that one too. Yeah. So the risk of overconfidence and complacency, and I don't ascribe that to Ange. I don't think that's his makeup, but I think there was probably a collective overconfidence within the support relative to where we are versus Rangers, and this came as a surprise maybe to some. I think the nature of it surprised me even. I mean, it was really pretty poor. But some of the things season long, and really since Beal came in, relative to how we've been performing, these narratives about gaps closing and all that stuff, I don't get caught up in that. But I'd say, heading into next season, if all other things are equal, and they won't be, because we've got more money and hopefully our recruitment's better and all these other things. But as things stand right now, I don't think that the gap in the points are reflective of kind of underlying fundamentals as far as quality of squads, that kind of thing. And that's why I don't want to see us be complacent. I wrote an article about that. I mean, it's I don't think we will be, but I don't think, just like the 25-point gap in the 2021 season was absurd. Wasn't anywhere near the fun. Did I lose you? The underlying fundamentals of the two clubs. I think on the margin, the current table standings are probably a little bit flattering relative to some of those. And so whether this was a wake up call or anything like that, I mean, I don't think it will be for the people at Celtic. I hope it isn't. I hope it doesn't need to be. But for some in the support, probably it was.
Speaking of lack of depth, I should acknowledge that we're not playing with a full deck of cards this week on the show. So Alan is off on a big long walk. He's probably walking.
These guys that retire and think they can just take vacation whenever the hell they want. I don't know. I don't know what we can do about this, Enda.
Well, we should acknowledge that the podcast will suffer as a result of not playing our first 11 or our best 11. So just wanted to say hello to Alan if he is listening on his walk. We will be missing you and your takes on the podcast this week. So bear with us as we try work our way through this game. Look, I think Cal McGregor and pretty much summed up the feeling afterwards. And that was that I don't think there was a problem with the intent of the Celtic players in this game, because, Cal McGregor did acknowledge that it wasn't good enough, and there are no games that are meaningless, especially against Rangers. And there's no games that are meaningless. Celtic would have wanted to win that game as much as Rangers did. But I think the reality of it is the first half was pretty close. Like, the Celtic did actually threaten quite a bit in the first half. O had that chance that he hit the post with, very unlucky not to score from that. I think Matt O'Reilly, who had a great opportunity, and it was a good attempt as well. It was just a brilliant save from McCrory. There was nets, and that game's a completely different, that brings a completely different complexion onto the game. The game ended with, I think a 0.5 differential in the XG altogether. Celtic had more possession in the game. I think it was just the flatness of the second half that was the problem. Celtic almost had. Do you remember the 4-0 win where Celtic were 3-0 up at halftime? And the second half was a little bit flat. Celtic just dominated possession. They just went through the paces, and Rangers didn't really threaten at all. Really didn't look like they were fighting back. That's sort of what Celtic had this weekend in the second half. Was it just flatness, really?
Yeah, I think so. You're right. The first half was kind of, I would say, I don't use the technical term yuck, meaning that I would say it probably shaded Rangers, but not in any kind of material way. And again, we talk about these players of moments. I don't think Abada was very good, but that was a great cross, right? And he has been a player of moments, meaning that he's fairly erratic. We've talked about that, and he comes up with these kind of big plays, and that was really good cross to O. That again, on another day, if they were playing their senior citizen keeper, O probably has an easier finish rather than a young keeper coming out and blitzkrieging him. But yeah, I think the XG in the first half was, I have it in front of me. It's a 0.54 to Celtic versus 0.48 to Rangers, but they scored twice. And as Alan talks about a lot, which is game state. So all of the fundamentals that we talked about relative to dead rubber and the turnover in players and it being kind of a yuck first half, and all of a sudden now you're down 2-0. Right? Are you going to come out and go nuts in the second half trying to claw it back? And almost all of that XG was on that chance too. So it's not like we were creating a bunch of chances in that first half. There's a couple other ones. You said the O'Reilly, Abada had a bit of a chance. That was pretty much it. I thought they had a little bit one off of a corner, but nothing, again, material. So again, the balance of play was tilted, shaded towards Rangers. They happened to score twice, for a couple of reasons that weren't great. So that's the game state aspect. And then in the second half, we basically had the big O'Reilly chance, and that was it.
Let's talk about some of the individual performances, and we might talk about Bernabé in a second, but for me, there is one player that stands out who was probably at fault for two of the goals. Don't mean to be too harsh to him, but in my opinion, that's what he actually was at fault for the two goals.
He's the wrong left-footed center back. Just come out and say it.
Well, this is a Liam Scales Stan podcast. We all know that. So, look, Kobayashi, slightly unlucky with the first goal. I will say that, but he is caught ball watching. If you watch the replay of the goal, he's looking at Joe Hart save the ball rather than paying attention to what his job is actually doing. And then his body shape is completely wrong and he's not able to react to Todd Cantwell getting onto the ball. And then the second goal, he is out-muscled by Suter for the corner. Now, we were talking before the podcast started, and we're kind of both in agreement that Kobayashi is not the man we would have put on Suter in the first place. So you also need to take that into account that, is it his fault that he is marking a person who's going to be stronger and taller and better in the air, or is that a fault of the general consensus that he would be the guy to mark him?
Yep. So this is this gets into the spreadsheet shagger aspect of all of this, which is trying to again, to use an analytics term or statistical term, is decompose the contribution aspects of all of this stuff, right? So you had what was a fairly okay chance from Lundstrom. I mean, it wasn't a good chance, but he put a decent shot on goal. Left-footed shot from an angle from outside the box. Probably not a great shot to decide to take, but he happened to put a decent shot on Hart, who proceeds to do a pretty poor parry. And again, that's reflected in his various advanced stats. I mean, he just basically dumped it right out in front of goal. Not great. Kobayashi doesn't respond really well, so there's some quote-unquote blame to share there. Cantwell, and credit to him, has a pretty nice finish. I mean, that's a ball that's bouncing. It's not like it just put on a platter for him. So he's got to strike that well, a little bit off the ground, which makes it on the margins a more difficult shot. And then he puts it right between Hart's legs. So again, is it a hard shot? Yes. Did he strike it solid? Yes. Is that a save that you want your keeper to make? Probably. But they're not going to make it 100% of the time, obviously. So again, you allocate a little bit of the blame to Hart on the shot stopping as well. So that's how you kind of decompose all of those things from an analytics perspective. And at least that's how I think about it. So yeah, Kobayashi gets a fair amount of the blame there, I think, on the narrative, because it's also on top of what happened with Suter. And I wrote a column. It happened to be last week, so it was before this game. StatsBomb just came out with this new metric called HOPS, which is I forget what it's a cute acronym, but it's basically like a it's almost like an ELO. It's not ELO. I forget the name. It's like a next generation of ELO, which was actually created to score chess players. And the way that it runs is basically taking the quality of your opposition into account as you basically score people, right? So the way historical aerial duel data that Alan's collected over time, that I've looked at over time, it was, okay, do they win their duels or do they lose them? And basically all this saying is, well, Kobayashi winning a duel against Sakala is not the same as him winning a duel against Suter. And over all of the duels that they have throughout their entire database or career that's on record, how do you adjust each of those duels relative to the strength of the opponent in the air, right? And it comes up with this kind of score, just like a chess player has their score as far as how good they are, supposedly, in their ranking. And so this data is out there now for Celtic, and just using that, Suter and Goldson rank significantly higher than any of our players. So that, and again, we've talked about this, like that out, and CCV's the top, by the way. So CCV is actually the best out of anyone on either team. And then, Starfelt is lower, much lower, and Kobayashi's much lower and on the weaker side for a center back. And then Suter and Goldson are right there, right behind CCV. So we have an inherent problem. We've talked about this for really since Ange's arrival, which is that we're kind of undersized and not great in the air. And it's, in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of just a risk that we accept because of, other considerations, right? You can't be all things to all. You have to have some kind of weakness on a relative basis. The question comes down is that Ralston actually is pretty good in the air, and he scores more like your kind of median center back, even though he's a right back. He's a bricky, right? And that's why he's more like a CCV version of a fullback because of how strong he is. So he's not as tall, but he's pretty strong, and he actually dwarfs either Starfelt or Kobayashi in this metric. And he was marking Sakala, who's like, I think the sample I created had a minimum of 200 aerial duels over the last 6 seasons in this database. And Sakala, out of like 10,500 players, Sakala is over 9,000. Like, he's horrible in the air.
Yeah.
And so you have Ralston marking a guy who's no threat in the air to speak of, where you've got Kobayashi marking Suter, who's actually better than Goldson and not too far behind CCV. So to me, that's a marking mistake. Again, thinking about attribution, right? So I don't even know if Celtic's using this yet. It's a brand new thing. But, you could make an argument that the real responsibility or the material responsibility in that goal is, why is Ralston marking Sakala instead of Suter? And that doesn't say that Kobayashi couldn't have done better. But again, it's like, he's not a big, strong guy. He's going to be at a deficit in that situation inherently to Suter. And it's a matchup problem.
Yeah, I think that matches. I mean, before anybody gets into the comments and starts calling you a spreadsheet Jagger, I think that matches up pretty well with the eye test anyway. I mean, like, Suter, Goldson, both strong center backs, good in the air. If you look at Kobayashi in the last number of games that he's played, in the air is where he has looked quite weak. So I'm not sure it was the correct decision to have him marking one of the stronger headers of the ball for a corner for Rangers. And I just looking back at the goal, Celtic are definitely going with a man-to-man system here. They're not going with like an in-between sort of zonal man-to-man or just fully zonal. They are man-to-man here. So if that's what they're going to do, now I personally do prefer a man-to-man system, but I think if you're going to go with that, you need to make sure that you've got your man-to-man, lined up pretty well. So get your strongest players on their strongest players and put your weaker players in positions that, they're not going to be isolated or made look a fool like Kobayashi kind of was at the weekend. So yeah,
Well,
I think that,
and in fairness to Suter, it was a good header too. I mean, that's not, that's probably like a 10% chance. I can look at what the XG was, but even all things considered, and that Suter's a pretty good player in that position. I mean, that's a phase of play that he is. It's a relative strength for him. It's still not a slam dunk. I mean, he still did a really good job in finishing that particular chance. And again, it's not a save that I think you criticize Hart over not making, but it's also one that you kind of want a keeper to do better on theoretically. Again, particularly at the Champions League level, because that's the kind of situation where on the margin you're going to face more players that are going to be able to put those kind of chances on goal. So I thought that was, again, from an attribution perspective, it's a very small demerit to Hart, not a big one, more of a opportunity cost kind of thing. But like I said, generally it's a matchup problem. I think it's unrealistic to think that Kobayashi is going to win that matchup with any kind of consistency, given the gap in relative abilities in the air.
Another point I would make on that is that I think it's Jota. You can't really see from the TV angles, but he's the man that's doing what's sort of the hole / front post job. And he comes off just enough that he can't get a block on, so it's sort of like a mixture of all sorts of problems. Because Alan said that, you do 3 things wrong in a row, like you've got a chance of conceding, and Celtic did multiple things in a row wrong there. So they were punished. We'll go to Bernabé next then, because I guess outside of Kobayashi, he's probably the one that's come under most fire after this game. He was dispossessed 4 times. I think it's more in the possession stuff that is probably driving people mad than the out of possession stuff. But we didn't really see much from Bernabé that we haven't seen before here. I think the problem is that it hasn't been shaded over by other players. Like, Celtic didn't go and win this game because of Rio Hatate being brilliant in midfield or scoring a worldly from the goal, or Jota taking control and things like that. The difference is people didn't overshadow Bernabé's bad performance here. This is something we've seen before from him.
Yeah, I think this is a classic case of confirmation bias and narrative, meaning that out of Bernabé's various performances, I wouldn't categorize this one as like catastrophic. To your point, like we've talked about this, where his relative strengths and weaknesses are. He didn't really get much of a chance at all to display where his relative strengths are, not to a material degree, because we weren't really the dominant team in midfield. We didn't really control the game in their attacking third to a significant degree. And again, Hatate didn't have a great game. He gave the ball away quite a bit, which again, he's apt to do. We've talked about that. So yeah, back to Alan's patent on potential for toxic combinations. This was kind of a toxic combination situation, and particularly given the tactics that Rangers deployed, I think. So yeah, I thought Bernabé was actually okay within the context of what his strengths and weaknesses are. I think that the fact that we lost 3-0 to Rangers in a derby is the overarching, umbrella that covers all of this and shades all of the narrative. And then, the whipping boys end up becoming narrative driven and confirmation bias. And because certain people have very positive glow from supporters, rightfully so, right? People like Callum McGregor, right? You're not gonna fillet Callum McGregor, based off of just who he is and generally how well he plays, but he had a pretty bad game as well. Some big, directly responsible for contributing to a goal being conceded in kind of a laughable way. And normally that would be the thing that in a derby players get harangued over, but he justifiably gets a mulligan. And these other guys don't have that luxury, and so they're not getting mulligans. If anything, they kind of swing the other direction, which is, you know, the kind of outsized response in some ways.
That kind of covers the comment that came in from Four Right on Twitter asking, is it fair to judge fringe players on after a one-off match like this? Why didn't stronger fringe players like Iwata/Moy, who have shown more, play on Saturday? So, like, I mean, I sort of covered that at the earlier stages of the show, is that I don't think it's fair to judge any of these individual players or any of the players as individuals based upon this selection of team, this team selection, because
Right.
like I said, you will not see this amount of changes made on a general day for Celtic over the course of a season. It's very, very unlikely that, because some of these are forced changes, like Cameron Carter-Vickers being out of the team, like Johnson being out of the team, and then some of them are not forced. They're just players needing game time. The season's already wrapped up. It's very, very unlikely that we'll ever have to rely on this combination of players ever again. I would say it's probably never going to happen that Celtic will play that starting 11 ever again.
Right. And again, if you're
then,
thinking about if you're thinking about, okay, we want to give Bernabé, and obviously it's pretty much, I mean, because him and O are the two, right? I mean, Kobayashi's pretty much the lockdown starter at this point with CCV out for the rest of the season. So you've kind of got to play him with Starfelt, particularly with the cup final being the last kind of big priority. So you're really talking about Bernabé playing and and relative to Moy and Iwata. I mean, if you're going to play those two guys and give them some minutes, again, they're young players. You've invested in them a decent amount for Celtic terms financially. Are they going to be part of the future? I mean, it's way too early, but Bernabé's been here long enough now. It's like, okay, you've got to start. Again, this is the time of the season where he's got to get minutes if he's ever going to be part of the plan, in my view. So, I do you then incur more change and play Iwata and Moy, let's say, for, I don't know, Hatate and McGregor? Would they have been better? Like, you know what I mean? I mean, he played the first pick for the most part midfield. I would argue sensibly to try and create a foundation, a platform from which you would think Bernabé would have a better game. He's got Jota in front of him. You know what I mean? Like, I could see the logic behind it. It surely didn't work, but I have a hard time thinking how, it's always easy ex post, but kind of ex ante ahead of time, like thinking that Iwata and Moy were going to give these younger players a better platform to thrive in this kind of a derby match. So the counter narrative is always easy. That's why they say in American football, the most popular player is always the backup quarterback.
Yeah.
Right? Because if your team stinks, it's that he's the designated savior that would always be better than the crap that you're putting up with. And I think we've got a bit of that with this game.
Well, it's sort of like the idea that Celtic stood still as well by just securing permanent signings of Jota and Cameron Carter-Vickers, as opposed to bringing in the new guy, the new name, who's going to be better again in that position. But I guess just to finish on the team selection, because there is a comment that I do want to touch on. It might be an interesting conversation for the rest of the show. But if you look at the starting 11 down the left-hand side, I mean, you've got Bernabé, Hatate, and Jota. You've got the three most risky guys in possession on the left-hand side the entire way down the left flank. Bernabé, we've spoken time and time again, when he plays, he tries to play the dangerous pass most of the time. Hatate is a risk-taking midfielder. He's not a controlling midfielder. And then Jota is, again, not someone who you're going to rely on to maintain possession of the ball. He wants to dribble at people. He wants to go at people. So that's the left side for me was probably the worst side. And
And
then on the
on
right
the
hand side,
margin, Kobayashi's also a bit of a risk taker from playing deep. So add
yeah,
that into the mix.
add
Yep.
that in. On the right hand side, you've got, you know, Matt O'Reilly aside, because I thought he had a pretty decent game. Like Abada is a player who likes to arrive late at the back post, and he's playing on the same side as a player who likes to cross the ball in rather than, uh, playing off the winger. So, I mean, these are the combinations. These are the issues. You probably have to lay some of the blame at Ange's door here for the starting lineup. If you're going to blame anybody, I think the starting lineup is wrong and was wrong and was proven to be wrong. But ultimately, I can't find myself being absolutely, frustrated or angry or furious about this. Yeah, you got to play these players at some point, and if you don't, then what's the point in having them at the club in the first place? So,
Well, and
if you can't do,
what's the old saying, Enda? How do you learn? Right? You don't learn through easy, uh, defeating Ross County 7-0. You learn through failure. You learn through making mistakes and then overcoming them. And I'm a little more agnostic on, um, you know, I think the idea that we have to 100% optimize to try and win every single game once you've already clinched the league, like the health of the club longer term is part of it is playing younger players or, you know, stress testing certain things, right? Some of this is like a laboratory. Maybe Ange had some of these things that he wanted to try out and figure out whether some of these combinations. I mean, I have no clue, but my point is the idea that doing that at any time is unacceptable is, I think, kind of crazy. Meaning that um, it's not the end of the world that this
yeah,
went pretty bad, and I think there's reasonable debate to be had about whether the lineup made sense, and that's fun. That's what we do as fans. But given all these other factors, to me, it doesn't get kind of my back up and saying, "Oh, this was like some terrible decision," because you don't know what the drivers of the decision making are, and I think there's reasonable aspects that you could say, okay, going with this certain kind of lineup to see how things go. Okay, didn't work out. What ultimately, in the long grand scheme of things, what does that mean?
mm.
I would argue nothing.
Yeah. I think this is as much as Anne said it wasn't a freebie. I think it is. It's a little bit of a freebie
Well, he
for
can't say that.
the team
I mean,
overall. The
yeah.
team
I mean, he,
overall. I wouldn't say individuals. I do think there will be individuals that will suffer as a result of this, but you
yeah. No,
know,
no Celtic manager with an IQ over 10 is going to come out and say that a game against Rangers, didn't matter, so to speak. I mean, that's
yeah.
asinine. Of course, he's not going to say that.
I've lost the original comment, but I've got the gist of it anyway. Essentially, people talking about the size of the team,
Hmm.
um, and the importance of size and the lack of size that Celtic have aerially. You mentioned it earlier. Again, I can't find myself being overly, you know, negative about this in the first place because, well, firstly, you don't want to end up with a team full of, 6'2", 6'1" players who can't play football. You need
Right.
to have a healthy mix. I think Celtic are just shy of a healthy mix. I don't think there's a dramatic fall off given the style of play that we play against the opposition that we play. I don't think that Celtic overly need to focus on having big, strong, burly players within their side. Now, there is the exception of Champions League football, where again, if you look at Celtic starting lineup, Cameron Carter Vickers is probably the only one that you're saying is Champions League standard in the air. And physicality wise in midfield, we're probably lacking a bit of pace. But outside of that, and when we're talking purely about size, does size matter with Celtic? Because I don't think it does. Massively.
Yeah.
Massively is the
Well,
most important word in there.
fortunately, my life credo with my wife is that size doesn't matter. So I tend to be biased and leaning towards that. So that I want to get that out of the way first, because I am biased. But we've talked about this in the past, and actually at the Champions League level, it's less of an issue because particularly being a pot 4 or maybe aspirationally at some point a pot 3 team, you're not feeling, you're not facing the shelling as a primary strategy from most pot 1 and 2 teams. Like they're generally playing a more modern progressive type of game. It's not to say on the margin it's not an issue, but I think it's more of an issue domestically. And again, we're so dominant the vast majority of the time. Now, I will say that because of this, based off of again this hops thing that I mentioned earlier, swapping out CCV for Kobayashi is a material downgrade, like a relative and this is, you kind of think
In the
about
air, you mean?
in the air. Yes, only in the air. Well, overall, I would argue probably too.
Yeah, well, yeah.
It's dramatic in the air, meaning that CCV is like to your point, kind of a legit Champions League level guy in the air, and then Kobayashi is, arguably not even SPFL level in the air for a center back, right? As far as strength and just winning aerial duels. So you swap those two guys out, and Starfelt's kind of okay in that capacity, but not a dominant force. And now all of a sudden, even a guy like Ash Taylor, like you get into the teams like Kilmarnock that are, he's so you'll run into people that domestically in Scotland that are really good in the air. You'll run into that in League One in England, right? I mean, it just takes you to be big and strong and be able to jump a little bit. So it's not that you want to swing things. I don't think you want to swing things in that direction or optimize on that. I think if you're going to pick a relative weakness, that's probably okay. It's just that right now, I also would say you kind of want someone that's at least top notch, at least one. And again, all other things being equal, you'd want a keeper that's a little better coming off the line, probably, which we don't have. So it's been a relative weakness. Fortunately, we've been so dominant domestically that for the most part, it hasn't mattered because we don't give up that many free kicks. We don't give up that many corners. And just generally teams aren't good enough to be in possession long enough to work the ball out wide and have midfield runners and have, their strikers in a position where they can, just kind of organically build up play to the point where they can whip crosses in. And, again, that this is where it was glaring for Rangers competitively this season against us, is that outside of their center backs, they don't either. I mean, Morales is not, even for a striker, he's not great in the air, and none of their other attacking players, for the most part, are Kolak, if he plays okay in the air, but not great. Even for a striker. So, again, if you got CCV against Morales, it's not even a competition. Like, he just relatively swats them away because the disparity is so great. So it really is just about free kicks and corners. And, that's certainly where it arose on the weekend.
Well, that's what Hit the Top mentions in the comment as well. He says that a more dominant goalkeeper makes up for the lack of height. And I think this is quite funny because I saw this on Twitter the other day, and it's the two things that most that data nerds and that old football men, let's call them, have in common when it comes to their views on football is that, number one, the manager doesn't make enough substitutions, and number two, the goalkeepers need to be more proactive. Like, if you're looking at the way that football is going, everybody wants their goalkeeper to be off their line. The words of the De Gea's and the Joe Hart's is quickly dying out, and people want to come and just have a goalkeeper that's so proactive, basically playing midfield a lot of the time, and is coming and just punching the ball when it comes from a corner. That's the way the football's going now.
Yeah, and again, this is where I think this issue of optimization is important. Meaning that I actually have given Ange a lot of credit for being flexible enough to adjust with Hart relative to kind of what I know my expectations were as far as how he was likely to utilize his keeper when he arrived at Celtic is even before Hart was brought in, and he very quickly pivoted off of that after giving Hart a little bit of a chance to have that give that a go. So I actually think there are. Because I wrote a column about this a couple of weeks ago, is they did a kind of a refresh analysis on the keeper. So if you look at Club Bruges, they got shelled in the Champions League. Like they did not like play dominant in a way where but Mignolet had an insane group stage where he saved them like 6 goals because he just had an incredible run of shot stopping, right? And if you think back about how did Celtic have any European success, in kind of the last 10 years, it was basically one guy standing on his head, like Forster against Barcelona, and Lazio home and away. I mean, those were the kind of the big accomplishments in Europe. And it was because our keeper wasn't because we dominated play. That's for sure. So I think there's an argument to be made, or at least a debate to be had about the importance of these aspects of keeper play. And the idea of having a Forster or a Hart try to do some of this stuff, I think is kind of silly. I mean, you're going to put them in a position to fail because they don't have the mobility. They may not have the instinctual decision making. Again, you put people in situations where they're less comfortable, they're usually, less likely to make quality decisions. And that's where something like we've talked about John Harrison, who's really started to pioneer some of the stuff on keeper play as far as modeling decision making, like when to come out on a 1 versus 1, like what situations should the keeper rush, when should they do a spread say, when should they do, all these different very specific keeper related decision making, and looking at it from a probability perspective. So yeah, I actually I've come down based off of the 2 seasons now where we've gone through Ange's style of play relative to the domestic competition, that I'm leaning towards, particularly at the Champions League level, that we need to really prioritize shot stopping. Because I just don't think we're going to be able to upgrade in midfield and other aspects of play at that level against pot 1 and 2 teams that we're not going to give up a lot of chances. Like we just are. And we may not be as much as this past season, but we gave up like a ton of chances. To cut it by 20%, we'd still be in like the top third of teams in how much they concede. And I don't mean that in a good way. I mean that, too much. And when you're dealing with those level of finishers, you give them that many chances, that's when you get 5 goals scored against you like we did in certain games. So yeah, I actually, I've come around on that a little bit relative to Celtic, specifically under Ange.
Club Brugge are an interesting club because they seem to be doing all the right things, and then they hired Scott Parker before their Champions League and got absolutely, destroyed. So, I mean, that goes to show you one bad decision away from a lot of progress being taken apart in a matter of months. So, look, we shall see what happens. As we wrap this up, I guess my conclusion from this, and we'll get your conclusion now in a second, is that, look, are some of these players good enough for Celtic? Are they going to be at the club next year? Are they going to be the first or second choice at the club? I'd argue for most of the players who came in as replacements at the weekend, no. Does that mean they're not good enough to be replacements individually on an individual basis? I'd also say no. I would say most of them probably are good enough to come in, especially at the SPFL level. And am I overly annoyed at the situation? Yeah, I'm a bit annoyed that Celtic lost the derby and the performance wasn't good, but I'm also accepting that they've been phenomenal pretty much all season. They're probably wreck tired. And look, it wasn't great that it ended up being the game against Rangers that came after Celtic had won the league and these changes are being made. It would have been nicer if Celtic had an Aberdeen or a Hibs or someone else to have a buffer game to get these players in their first game. Not excusing the losing, not excusing the performance, but yeah, I think my overall conclusion to this would be that probably shouldn't be too overly annoyed or disappointed or have a state of the nation sort of discussion as a result of this result.
100% agree. But I even think there's nuance amongst the three guys. I mean, in that I don't even think of Kobayashi as a quote unquote replacement because of what's going on, as I mentioned. But Ralston's in for a guy who's injured, and Ralston's been very good under Ange domestically. I don't think he had a particularly bad game. I mean, he wasn't a standout as far as big errors or anything like that. And again, we've talked about this over and over again, that the striker position in Ange's system is largely a derivative one, meaning that they're not on the ball that much, and we weren't creating chances, and we did not win the midfield battle. So, I have, and he didn't, he had one big chance, and I thought was pretty good on it, and just didn't, quite score it, which is, that's going to happen. And Bernabé, like we said, has been here long enough that I would think Ange would have a pretty good handle on whether he's good enough for what he wants to do. And he either is or he isn't. And if he isn't, then they probably make plans about what they're going to do about it. And if he is, then he can continue to develop and hopefully improve and make the improvements that he needs. I have no clue. I mean, that's when people say an Ange we trust, like I'm always the trust but verify type, but that is the kind, like, that's kind of his job. Like he's got to make those kind of determinations on whether some of these players are good enough. And that goes back to, unless they play some, how do you even render that kind of an opinion? Is it all just training? Well, maybe, but clearly he saw fit to play him. And again, I didn't think he was that bad.
Yeah, Bernabé is probably the only one that I'm coming out with question marks over, but I'm not judging him just on this game. I think
agreed. Yep.
I think the idea of whether or not Bernabé is good enough to be Celtic starting left back has been well and truly, that debate's over. It's been over all season. The fact that he hasn't been able to displace Greg Taylor, yeah, he's not good enough to be Celtic's first choice left back because he's proven over the course of the season he's not. I'm not making that judgment on this game because that would be unfair to do. It'd be unfair to write someone off after one game. But if you're not able to dispel the player that you're supposed to be battling for his place, then no, you're clearly not good enough to be the starting left back. So Celtic might need to look at getting someone in who's going to be pushing Greg Taylor a little harder. That could be underway. We just don't know. And just to add final context to sort of my reaction to this game or my general overall feelings, I will say this: I am coming at this from a complete armchair fan perspective. I'm not a match-going fan. I don't pay for a season ticket. If I did pay to go see this game, would my opinion of these players be a little bit different? I'd probably be fairly fucking pissed off. But I'm not. So therefore, I'm not. I think that's where we'll finish off the show then, James. Again, apologies to everyone in the comments. We are short-staffed. We're, you can't get the staff these days. Alan decided to take a week and a half off to go for a walk. So, James, look, in the words of Mr. Stephen Arbuckle, who was in the comments earlier, just not good enough.
It just isn't. I think he's off contemplating many important issues in life. So we wish him the best. Hopefully he recharges the batteries to come back refreshed and ready to go into the long summer break where we won't have podcasts either. So I don't know what he's doing. The scheduling, it's pretty shocking. And he took 10 days off when we're wrapping up the season. I don't know. It's like he took a pre-vacation for his summer vacation. I don't get it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, as I said, we'll be looking into, already looking at, the summer transfer in the same way as Celtic are. So, if he doesn't step up his game, then look, nobody's place is safe at the end of the day. Before we wrap up, there is one last comment coming in, James, from G Raccoon, who's asking any recommendations for sites for learning about football data analysis.
Oh yeah, DM me on Twitter at Juco James. I'll send you some stuff. Probably better than trying to put it together here.
Yeah, makes sense. James, thanks very much.
Thanks, Enda.
And thanks to everybody who's watching in the comments on YouTube. If you're watching and you're new to the show, hit subscribe. And if you're not, hit like and keep the comments coming as well. At Huddle Breakdown is where you can get us on Twitter, and you can get the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or anywhere that you get your podcast. We'll be back next week. We're going to have a special show. We're going to be talking about finances. So anybody who likes to talk about finances in football, then next week is the show for you. Until then, we'll chat to you next week. Good luck.